Alright guys, this is the first online lecture for this year, the 2013 version of Connorland APUSH, Chapter 7 in your book, also known as The Road to Revolution. First thing we're going to talk about is the colonies before Revolution as a way of a little background and stuff like that, and then we'll move into the actual events as the lecture goes on. The first thing to take notice of when we're talking about the colonies before the Revolution is, first of all, they're proud to be a part of the British Empire. They still consider themselves Englishmen and also to have the rights entitled to them by being part of the British Empire and still being English. Second, there's a relatively high standard of living in the colonies at this time compared to other places in the world. This is due to a couple of things that we've already talked about. One is the plantation economy located in the southern colonies, and also the bit of manufacturing that's going on in New England. Third of all, and one of the most important factors that will play into the events that are coming up, the British are not bothering them a whole lot. There's not a lot of interference going on. Now, this is done through a process of something called Salutary Neglect that we'll look at in a second. Salutary Neglect basically boils down to this. Britain basically tells them, we're going to leave you alone if you can handle these two very simple things. A, produce more wealth. In other words, keep pumping money into the mother country, in this case, England. And two, don't be a pain in their tail, alright? Don't cause a lot of friction. Don't get riled up about stuff and things like that. If you can do these two things, we're pretty much going to leave you alone. Britain's role in Salutary Neglect is as following, and it goes back to if the colonies can hold to these two things I talked about in the last slide. Number one, if they can do this, Britain is going to provide peace and protection to the colonies. Two, they're going to ensure law and order in the colonies. And three, they're going to send immigrants to keep the labor supply up. Now, these three things are done in effect to keep the colonies' economy up and keep everything rolling where Britain can keep getting money from the colonies and to help out their own economic standing. Now, to kind of close out this part, what ends up happening from Salutary Neglect is three basic things. One, we end up with 13 separate colonial governments. Two, manufacturing increases. And three, smuggling begins to run rampant in the colonies. Now, two of these things are going to eventually end up going into or being a part of the road to revolution with the colonial governments and the smuggling, and we'll get to those here in a little bit. I want to take a second and step back and look at a broad economic theory called mercantilism. Now, what mercantilism is how colonial powers during this time period, be it England, be it France, be it the Dutch, it's how they justified control of their colonies. And basically what it boils down to is you want to export more products than you import. In other words, you want to sell more than you buy. And colonies played a very vital role in this from the two things that you see here. Number one, colonies' roles were to supply raw materials, and number two, to provide markets. If we looked at just a random example of this, let's look at furniture. All right, if Britain was in the furniture-making business, the colonies' role would be to supply the wood for Britain to make the desks and then to provide the market or the people who would buy the finished product. So as you can see, the colonies are kind of out of the middle part of it or the manufacturing of it. From the colonies' standpoint, it does leave them at somewhat of an economic disadvantage, but from the perspective or the point of view of European powers during this time period, it makes perfect sense because it's a perfect way for them to get cheap materials for products and also markets that are only able to buy their goods. So for that reason, it really ups their exports at the end of the day, leaving them with a favorable balance of trade. Now, there are good and bad points when it comes to the point of view or the perspective of the colonies. First of all, on the good side, they do enjoy somewhat of a trade advantage because they have a dedicated trading partner in Britain. Two, they also get military protection to kind of help them out with the Indian problems as they expand west and other things that are going on. From the bad point of view, they're very dependent on Britain, so they're kind of at their whim. If sales go down in Britain, they don't have any other options or ways to sell their products. In other words, they can't sell to anybody else. It also ends up at the end of the day hurting the manufacturing sector of the colonies at this time, even though it is kind of small compared to the rest of the world. The reason for that was shown in the last couple of slides, in the fact that all goods were manufactured or the finished products were made in Britain, so there was no need to really have a strong manufacturing base here. Now, it's one thing to have mercantilism in effect as a theory. It's another to be able to enforce it. So England had to find some way to make sure that the colonies held to their roles over time. And what they did was pass something called the Navigation Laws, which was basically a set of laws used to enforce the mercantilist system. Now, this was done in a couple of ways, and the provisions were as follows. Number one, the colonies weren't allowed to sell to anyone but Britain. Didn't matter what product it was, what finished manufacturing, what raw material, doesn't matter. It's only going to Britain. On the flip side of that, any goods that were coming to America that the colonists had bought from other countries had to go through England first. Now, the reason they did that is so they could put a tariff on it or an import duty. In other words, they're getting a little money off of everything that's making its way to the colonies. Now, one of the things we'll go over in class is how import duties, tariffs, etc. end up being the prices of that or the cost of that end up being passed on to the consumer. And that's kind of what's happening here. The goods end up costing more when they get to the colonies. Now we move on to one of the first acts that really kind of rubs the colonists the wrong way, and it's the Molasses Act of 1733. Now basically what it was a tax that was on molasses, sugar, and rum that was imported from foreign colonies not run by the British. In the case of this, we're talking about the French West Indies. The colonists come up, and this is one of the first things that they began to protest against, simply because they knew that the British West Indies, which was also a producer of rum, did not produce enough of this stuff to be able to satisfy the demand that was in the colonies at the time. So they're protesting because it's basically cutting their supply down. And as we see, the protests against taxes and things like that are going to come more and more into play as we get closer to the Revolutionary War. So that's some of the lead up and some of the early things that happened in the relationship between Britain and the American colonies. Now we move on to some of the reasons for the tensions, and a lot of it comes from the French and Indian War, which we talked about for our purposes in this class. You don't really have to know a lot about, just more or less the results, and this tension is one of the results. So the first thing we're going to look at is the results of the French and Indian War, and we're going to look at it from the American and British standpoint. All right, from the Americans, first of all, they gain a sense of confidence after the same because they basically won a war on their own territory, all right? So there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of accomplishment and things like that. So they're really riding high after this thing. From the British standpoint and from the way the Americans viewed the British, the aura of British troops disappeared after this. In other words, Americans who fought with the British realized that they weren't some awe-inspiring fighting force. They put their pants on the same way as anybody else. They still got sick. They still slept like anything else. In other words, they were basic human beings. They weren't any better than anybody else. They were just better trained and better equipped. So the aura, or I guess you could say the fear of British troops, or the intimidation factor of them, kind of disappears after this war. And what ends up happening is, as the British soldiers become more human, these tensions begin to rise, because as they see them as common people are just the same as them, that intimidation factor goes away. As you can see on this slide, there's several reasons for the tension that are coming up between the colonists and the British. And I'm not going to go through every one, but the bottom line on it is the British at this time, their army is a professional army. This is what these people do for a living. And they're still fighting a old style of warfare found in Europe at this time. So you see differences in fighting styles, like from the methods of fighting. You see less formality with the colonists. You see, I don't know, less of a rigid hierarchy, or less respect in the eyes of the British for their superiors and all this. In other words, the British at the end of the day don't think that the colonists act professionally, work hard, and all those. But you can go through these on your own and kind of get an idea of why these reasons came up. One thing we need to touch on before we get into the actual acts that led to the Revolutionary War is the fact that the colonies were not exactly united before this thing breaks out. As a matter of fact, they hadn't been united pretty much since the colonies had been founded, and there were several reasons for this. The first is geography, and we looked at it in the DBQ that you did. The geography in the north, between the north and the south, leads to different occupations, different lifestyles, different social aristocracies or social hierarchies as you go. Also, we have conflicting religions that we've talked about as well. Also, varied nationalities from the types of people or the types of Europeans that have come into the north and the south. Also, different styles of governments and boundary disputes. So, as we go through this, don't think that the colonies are completely united against the British. And if they are, it's not necessarily because of these factors right here. The last thing we'll get to before the actual acts that lead to the Revolution, and in some ways this can be tied into those as well, and it's the Proclamation of 1763 that comes about after the French and Indian War, or as you may see it known as, the 7 Years' War. Basically what it boils down to is that, as you can see from the map right here, Britain picks up a lot of land after the end of this war because the French have basically been kicked out of North America outside of a couple of outposts in a couple of places. Once this happens, colonists begin to move west into this new territory that they picked up. Well, when this happened, inevitably there's going to be clashes between them and Native Americans, and when this happens, it begins to cause trouble. So, in an effort to curb it or to stop it, Britain just says, okay, there is no more settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. In reaction to that, the colonists ignore it, and we start to see the seeds of some of the conflicts that are going to come down the line. Okay, now we get into the actual early British acts that led to the American Revolution. Now, some of these are going to be hit in-depthly, some of them are going to be just kind of glossed over, but don't think for a second that one is more important than the other ones. You need to know all these when it comes time for the test. Some of them we talked about in class, some of them are handled through reading questions, but each are equally important for your purposes. The first is the Currency Act passed in 1764, and just putting it very simply in an easy way to remember, it has to do with paper money. All right, they basically told the colonies you cannot print your own money anymore. It has to come from the crown and has to be in the style of money that was done and used in England at this time. The next act is the Sugar Act in 1764. Now, the main aim of the Sugar Act, and kind of what it boils down to, is it's enlarging or it's making expanding on the Molasses Act that we talked about earlier. Basically what it's trying to do is the same thing. It's basically giving the British West Indies a monopoly on sugar importation or molasses or rum or whatever it is into the colonies. Now, from the colonist perspective, and the reason it gets a little uproar is that it's the first act passed to specifically raise money for the crown. Alright, they do this for one of two reasons. Number one is to stop smuggling. They're trying to cut into that and get the money that they feel like they deserve. Two, they're trying to raise money to pay for, I guess you could call it, the activities of being an imperial power. In other words, this is not the only colonies. The American colonies are not the only ones that the British have, and these things have to be paid for. So they're trying to supplement that or bring money into the crown to help out with other activities. Next on the list is the Quartering Act of 1765, in which basically said that the colonists had to provide room and board for British troops. This included food, drink, quarters or places to stay, fuel, and transportation. Now, this is ones that were stationed in their towns, villages, cities, whatever it is. Okay, now we actually get to the events that actually lead to the revolution itself. In other words, the roller coaster has begun to go downhill, the snowball started rolling, however you want to look at it. These are the things that directly lead to the revolution. It doesn't diminish the importance of the things before, but we're now in the time period and close enough to where shots begin fired that these things can be directly traced to it. The first act in this crisis, and possibly one of the most important, and we handled this pretty in-depthly in class, but just to kind of go over it again, is the Stamp Act that was passed in 1765. Now, what makes the Stamp Act unique from the point of acts that have been passed before is that it is done strictly to raise revenue for the crown, and they were trying to raise money to pay off the debts incurred from the French and Indian War. In other words, they're trying to make the colonies pay for their own defense. The provisions of this act were as follows. It was simply a tax on paper goods. Basically, the way it went, if a paper good, be it a legal document, newspaper, marriage, death certificate, whatever it is, was to be distributed or sold, it had to have a stamp on it which certified that a tax had been paid. And remember, it's strictly for the purpose of raising money for the crown. Now, the colonists' reaction to this is pretty much what you would expect. They're immediately mad at it. All right, one, because it was done without the approval of colonial legislatures, and two, because they felt there was a difference between legislation and taxation. They felt that legislation could be dealt with external taxes. In other words, with tariffs and things like that, the British government had all the right in the world to place these things on the colonists because it didn't really affect them at a local level. They felt that a tax, and in this case a Stamp Act, which is basically what it was, should be left to the right of local governments. In other words, they should be able to decide for themselves what rates and what kinds of taxes were placed on the goods in their colonies. Now, from the British point of view, they felt that the colonies were already represented through a process called virtual representation, which meant that even if you don't have a voted member of Parliament, even though there is not a person from the colonies that is in attendance when these taxes are passed, it doesn't matter. You still are represented simply by being a colonies, and from the British point of view, they're doing what's best for the colonies. So this is one of the places where the first conflicts come up in the views of representation and how their rights as Englishmen might be affected by being colonists. As a response to the Stamp Act, the colonists formed the Stamp Act Congress, which does a couple of things. Number one, it demands the end of the Stamp Act. In other words, they say Britain has no right to do this to us because we're not represented in Parliament. And as you can see, the British already had their own point of view on that thing. The significance for this and the main point that you need to remember is that it sets a precedent. And this is a very important word. It kind of sets the stage for further resistance to the British. It's one of those things where the more and more you resist or the more and more you rebel in small ways, it becomes easier over time. So without this happening, we might not see the results in the acts that we're going to see going forward. We talked about in class some of the ways in which the colonists protested the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress obviously is a part of it, but they also did other things. The Sons of Liberty, as we talked about, organized resistance through several ways. One was debates in the colonies, within the colonies. Two, written opinions in newspapers, pamphlets, things like that. They also went as far as, and we talked about this in depthly, forming mobs, tarring and feathering, and things like that. But one of the most important things that they did was boycott English goods. Now, one of the reasons that the Stamp Act gets repealed is that the boycotts that the colonists put on English goods eventually begin to hurt English business. And when businesses start to hurt, it affects the common people or the people who are working for the business. So, as with anything, when the protest or when the effects of it begin to be heard loudly by Parliament or whatever government you're talking about, there's a chance that some action is going to be taken. The action in this case was in 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. Now, just because the Stamp Act was repealed by Parliament doesn't mean that they were happy about it. So more or less in retaliation for them having to do this, they passed the Townsend Act. And the main purpose of it was to punish the colonies for the Stamp Act uprising. Now, with the punishment because of the protest against the Stamp Act, the provisions of the Townsend Act were as follows. It basically boiled down to an import duty on glass, paper, paint, etc., or what are called indirect products. So, in effect, it's an indirect tax. The revenues that came from it were not necessarily to promote or to profit the British Crown. It was to pay for the royal officials who were there to collect the taxes. One of the most loud and famous reactions to the Townsend Acts was written by a man named John Dickinson, and it was called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, in which he made a couple of arguments. The first was he denied the right of the British Crown to levy taxes for revenue. In other words, it wasn't right for them to pass taxes simply to raise money. One of the ironic things about Dickinson is he, in fact, wasn't a farmer. He was a pretty wealthy Pennsylvania lawyer. Now, the reason he took on the persona of a farmer in this letter was to give him some sort of credibility and to convince readers that because it was a farmer, he wasn't being influenced by any marketplace or economic factors. He was just a man who was concerned about the things that were going on. We move forward from some of the acts, take a break from it for a second for the Boston Massacre. We talked about that pretty in-depthly in class, so I'm not going to go through it too much. But the bottom line is, look at the picture, figure out, was it American propaganda? We talked about what that is. It's what you need to think about, as well as the events of what happened. Moving on to the Tea Act in 1773. As a brief background, the British East India Company is going broke, and in an effort to help them out, the British Parliament gives them a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. Now, the end effect of this is that, and the reason the colonists protest, is that it's hurting American tea merchants. All right, there's still people who run this stuff back and forth in the colonies. It's taking business away from them, because when the British East India Company gets a monopoly, even with the tax, the price of tea from them is cheaper than it will be from anywhere else. So the colonies begin to protest to help out American tea merchants. Once the Tea Party happens, the British Parliament and the Crown is about fed up with the colonies. So in response, they pass the Intolerable Acts, which consist of several different points to it, but the main idea of it is that it's to flat out punish Boston. And they do this in several ways. The first of these provisions, and the most important for your purposes, is the Port Act, which closes the harbor at Boston. What it does is basically wreck the economy of that era. 2, Massachusetts Bay gets their charter revoked. In other words, they're not legally recognized by the Crown. 3, they now change the acts. Officials from England will no longer be tried in the colonies for any crimes or anything that they commit. They now have to be sent back over to England to receive their trial. Colonists see this as being unfair. And 4 is the Quartering Act, which we've already talked about, room and board, housing, drink, food, whatever it is for British soldiers. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies formed the First Continental Congress, which is where we'll wrap it up for this one. We will go on into it and handle it a little bit more in class. This wraps up the first online lecture for APUSH 2013. I realize it's not great. They will get better as we go. If you have any questions about it, let me know, but you will need to go over this thing for the purposes of your next exam, AP test, and all that good stuff.